Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, for another wonderful Active Learning Academy seminar. Today, our two presenters are Deborah Beat and Pilar Zuber, who are both members of the Active Learning Academy and join us from the Public Health Sciences Department. They're going to talk to us today about reimagining student learning materials. I'd like to give them a big thank you for putting together this presentation, and I will hand it over to them.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. It's really kind of weird because I'm used to being on the other side of this where I'm the one attending something. And so this will be an interesting experience. So my name is Deborah Beat. I am a member of the Active Learning Academy. I'm a lecturer in PHS and have been here for probably full-time for about 4 years, but I've been working with college students since about 2008. And so this is a topic that I think about a lot, learning materials and how we get students to learn. And I will allow Pilar Zuber to introduce herself as we are getting started.
Thank you everyone for being here. I am Pilar Zuber. I have been a member of the Active Learning Academy for more years than I think I can count now, Jules. It's been one of my favorite parts of being at UNC Charlotte. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Public Health Sciences. I'm also the program coordinator or program director for the Bachelor of Science in Public Health program. We are excited to be here today to talk to you about this particular topic, which is something that Deborah and I have been working on for a few years now in our shared class. So we share a class, Foundations of Public Health. And so this is something that we have been doing and we are ready to go. Yeah. And I am in charge of the slides. So if it's awkward, blame me. It's a lot of screens going on, guys. All right.
All right, so first we want to share some of our session objectives with you. By the end of the session, you should be able to recognize traditional versus non-traditional learning materials, identify considerations in choosing non-traditional learning materials, associate various types of learning materials with different course types and levels of learning, discuss different ways to engage students with learning materials, as well as we'll have a little bit of experimentation at the end with replacing a traditional learning material with a non-traditional one in a course that you might be teaching or about to teach. The other thing we wanted to make sure you knew is that we are open to questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to stick it in the chat or even unmute yourself when there's a lull and ask your question. We would prefer you do that than wait until the end. We also really, really like discussion, so you are encouraged to engage.
All right, so we are going to start out with a question for you. And again, you can drop your answers in the chat or you can unmute yourself. But what type of learning materials do you currently use in your classes?
I can't find my chat button. This is Alicia. Sorry, I'm on a different device today. So I typically use like research articles. So I'm having my students do a lot of journal reading, discussion board posts, and on occasion I'll do like poll everywhere depending on the classroom. So yeah.
All right, and I'm looking in the chat. I see mixes of textbook slides, case studies, readings, academic articles, some POGL activities, scholarly readings, news articles, blog posts, podcasts. So Sam uses a lot of different ones, but we're starting to see, some of the same ones that we use. And so as we go through, we look forward to showing what it is that we do and what things that you can do more in terms of what you've been doing. All right.
So as we're getting started, we wanted to tell you all a little bit about sort of how we approach teaching, which has impacted the way we then sort of go look at learning materials for our classes. So the first one is that we try to remove as many barriers from learning as possible. Unfortunately, no matter how many times we tell students, part of the way that they're going to learn in our class is that they have to engage with the learning materials, specifically the readings usually is what we're talking about. There's still challenges there. The second thing is we want the students to be as engaged as possible in the learning process before, during, and after class, so that it's a continuous process and not just when they show up for class. We like to promote curiosity, and we want students to want to seek out information on their own. And so we want to promote as much curiosity about whatever the topic is as possible. We want to also build student confidence in their ability to learn. I feel like this one is huge, because sometimes I feel like my students literally just feel like they're not capable, when that is not true. And then two more, we want students to be challenged to critically think. And then lastly, we'd like to make teaching as enjoyable for us as possible. I used to teach a class where there were 70 slides per class session. That is no longer true. But it was kind of terrible on some level. And I realized that I had to, if I was having a good time, like with the material, the students were more likely to engage. So making teaching enjoyable, not just for the learning process, just for them, but for us too, as instructors. So ideally, the first place that you start thinking about learning materials is with your learning objectives. And so your course should have, ideally, course objectives that are then tied to module objectives. And then your learning materials can cover all of your module objectives. So if you look on our slide, you will see this is for, okay, I will confess that this is for my best developed course. But it has every module, you will see the course objectives that I'm covering, the module objectives that are related to the course objectives. And then you will also see, and we gave you a page that wasn't too busy, you will also see where I am connecting not only their learning assignments, but anything that I give them to read, watch, etc., to their module objectives. So even though every student is not necessarily going to look at this, I have found this super helpful with me trying to organize what I want to privilege when I'm doing the course, and that include when I am putting the sessions together, including their learning materials. Yes.
So just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page, when we talk about traditional learning materials, we tend to think about sort of before class, during class, and then after class. So before class, we used to basically what we call the readings. And these are, for many of us, going to be textbook chapters. They may be, for some of you, as you said, peer-reviewed journal articles, or even things like technical reports or executive summaries. And in many cases, some combination of these, like, most of us will have, a list of things that they have to do before class. And then they come to class and we say, okay, during class, we're going to give you an instructor presentation, which for many of us is PowerPoint slides. And it's somewhat driven by the technology in the classroom. All of the classrooms on campus are smart classrooms and they have the podiums. And we as instructors have come to expect that that's what we should bring to class. And students have expected that that is what is in our class. And it's not to say that these traditional learning materials are bad. The goal here is not to walk away from traditional materials, but to complement them. And so thinking about how we use PowerPoint slides in our class sessions. I even had a class a couple weeks ago where I didn't bring a slide presentation, and the students were so discombobulated. They're like, I don't know what's happening. There's nothing on the screens. And so there are ways to use them that's not, as Deborah said, a 70 slide presentation that you go through in 75 minutes, and the slides each have like paragraphs on them. Some of you may use textbook materials. Many of our textbook publishers now provide accompaniments. They provide additional activities and things that can be done either paper-wise or electronically. Many textbook publishers now have digital copies and digital resources that go along with the textbook. And then we also have started to use videos, which could be documentaries, and many of us have started to use TED Talks. So these would all be things that we would use during a class meeting. And then after class, we might think about things like sharing the PowerPoint slides with them. Some of you may do that before class, so they come to class with the slides and they can follow along. Or some of you may do it after class and say, okay, here's the notes that we went over. Some of you may also use review questions from the textbook. One of the things we have found, though, is that the after class part is probably the last time that we think about, or it's the last time we're the least likely to engage them afterwards with any sort of learning materials. We say, here's what you get before, here's what you get in class. And we tend to not think about what that follow-up after class might look like. So this came up on Overheard University. It's an Instagram account. And so sort of our question is, this is our goal. We want students to think, wow, that class was different because I was prepared. When I came to class, I did the readings. So our goal here is to try and help answer that question of how it is that we can make this happen for all of us.
Okay, so the first thing that we consider when we are approaching sort of, let's choose some non-traditional materials. The first thing would be to consider the learning objectives. What is it that we want them to learn? The next thing, how do we then best engage? And so there we're going to think about the length of the materials, the number of materials, the variety of perspectives we would like them to engage. So here I might give both sort of a article that points out all of the pros, but also the cons of a particular topic that I might be covering. So that there's some balance, right? It's not all good, if that makes any sense. And then also some reflection of the students in the materials. And so I do, in one of my 3000 level classes, I do a lot of work on professionalism with students. And so one of the things that we discuss is the bias in professionalism. And we also I try to make sure that if I am giving TED Talks or other videos, that they're not just from one type of person, that they are seeing a variety of experts talk about whatever the topic is. So that's just one way. These are a couple of different ways for you all to be thinking. Other things that you might consider are going to be the level of understanding, the appropriateness of the material. So the level of understanding that your students come in with. So 3 years ago now, I have 2020 sort of doesn't exist. So I think in 2019, I learned this term, transactional distance, which by an instructional designer in CTL, Karan. I don't remember Karan's last name right this second, but that's who gets the credit for teaching me this. So the distance between the instructor's understanding of the topic and the student's understanding, which is often a gulf. And I can't approach learning from the perspective of them being, thank you, Jules, being at my level, because they're not. They don't have 20 years of public health experience in their belt, so therefore they're able to easily understand these concepts. And when I am thinking about learning materials, I have to consider that. where are my students at their, and where are my students in terms of their capacity to learn and their ability. So even the types of materials I'm giving them, how easy is it for them to engage with that? And so closing the transactional distance is something that I think about with all of my classes. Not always great at it, but I try. So level of understanding students come in with is definitely one of them. And then the purpose of the course, right? So where is this course in the learning?
Curriculum.
Thank you. I'm like, there's a word in the curriculum that it is part of. So if it is a course that another course will build on, then I might think of it differently than if it's a one-off course where a student is just taking it because they're interested in that particular topic. And so a foundational course is definitely going to be different than a non-foundational course, if that makes any sense. The other thing is that the level of rigor or reliability. On the slide, we also give you the media bias chart as just an example of like one way of trying to figure out what is the level of rigor and reliability, especially of things like news articles, et cetera, that you might share with a student. Okay. And then the level of engagement. So here we're talking about, I kind of already talked a little bit about this, but like, so is it just one specific topic to a module? So am I only talking about, for instance, in my Intro to Health Professions class, I only talk about aging in the health system in one module. And so the things that I look for give them a far more rounded view versus if I'm doing a semester-long engagement, especially if there is accompaniment, if there is no textbook, I might be looking at things where I can build, the reading build on itself, or the learning materials build on themselves to sustain engagement on one topic.
So now we sort of look at what we have kind of cultivated together as what some of these non-traditional learning materials could be. We'll go through some. That's not an all-inclusive list. And again, this isn't necessarily a replacement for any materials you currently use, but ways to round it out. So one of the things that you may have noticed, is we've tried to get away from the term readings, even though that's the more kind of traditional approach. And so in our classes, we call them learning materials. Sometimes I might label something as a reading to let them know this is something they need to read versus a video, something that they need to watch. But always making sure that they understand that the expectation is not necessarily read. But readings could be websites. Depending on your course, it could be industry-specific websites, professional associations. So there are times in our courses where we have one of our learning materials is a page on the American Public Health Association website. And then we'll complement that with newspaper articles. Some of our favorites are the New York Times and the Washington Post. But again, if you go back to that media bias chart, you can sort of figure out what sources might be best for you. And then popular magazine articles. So, things that are not traditional peer-reviewed articles, but still cover some of those materials. We may do visual ones as well. These could be an infographic, pictures, or even an abbreviated PowerPoint presentation. And so sometimes we will, if we may cover, 16 slides in class, maybe we'll give them some that's like 10, that's kind of the highlights of it. Sometimes it's something that we could do a little bit, we've approached a little bit of a flipped classroom approach in one of our classes, taking advantage of what we built for online. Last year, we did a lot of recorded lectures. And so we will give them the recorded lectures ahead of time. And then in class, we go through like an abbreviated one, and then we will share it with them so they can see both of them. In terms of videos, we may give them animated videos, TED Talks. They've become really for I think a lot of people, a really good source of plain talking. In many cases, I just did a peer observation of a colleague, and they were talking, the lecture, the topic included drug pricing, so medication pricing. And instead of trying to spend 3 or 4 slides going through this really complex issue, gave a link to a TED Talk where someone who's an expert in the field spends 10 to 12 minutes, explaining how it works. They may also utilize tutorials, particularly those of you who teach maybe in some of the hard sciences, the STEM classes, where if they just need a little bit of extra assistance and understanding a particular concept, and you may not have class time to do that, Khan Academy has a lot of them where they can spend, these 5 to 10 minute videos, again, explaining a concept, so that they can feel more confident and prepared when they do go to class. We've also found some short films, maybe TV episodes and clips. John Oliver has become one of our favorites. John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, he covers a lot of public health related issues. And so we will do them sometimes in class. We will sometimes do them. We actually had an assignment where students chose one and basically analyzed it. And then we will sometimes give it to them as additional, if you're interested in this. And earlier, Deborah talked about one of the purposes was to try and increase like student curiosity and finding their own information. And these are often the ones where that happens a lot, because they'll watch one John Oliver video or one TED Talk, and then it has a suggested one. And so they will, be like, I watched the one on medical bias, and then I watched the one on this. And so things that are just kind of fun. John Oliver is one that we do give a little bit of a disclaimer. He likes to curse, just so that students are prepared for that. But, we have found that his work is really reliable. I mean, they do a great deal of research. And so it's a fun way of getting that information across. And then some industry specific ones, professional organizations oftentimes put together recordings of webinars or short videos with information. And then the instructor video presentations, again, utilizing that kind of flipped classroom approach where you can say, here we are, with this information, you watch this before we come to class, and then we can spend class time on more activity-based learning. And so now we'll take just a minute or so, and if there's any that you use that we've not gone over here. I know some of you mentioned things like podcasts in the original questions in terms of what you use, but if you would like to share any others that you currently use that we've not listed here, that we can, that way everyone gets the benefit from what everyone is doing. And while you work on that, we have a little bit of a treat for you. We want to share with you this video that we have been using in our public health class. This is the YouTube channel that we have found called Extra History, where they put together these cartoons that cover a whole bunch of historical events. And they've, I guess, got wind that we needed some for public health and the things that we do in our class. And so just to give you a short taste of what it looks like.
In 1902, a new disease appeared in the American South. Each spring, red scabby rashes would flare up among victims' faces, arms, and legs. They'd become depressed and lose weight, suffering terrible diarrhea. The worst cases went mad, speaking to the dead or snatching up kitchen knives to hunt invisible intruders. When the weather cooled, the rashes faded, until next spring. In the decade to come, the plague whipped through orphanages and mental asylums, mill towns and villages. Between 1907 and 1912, doctors confirmed 25,000 cases. 40% of the inflicted died. The disease had a name, pellagra, and no one knew what caused it.
And as you can see, this one is 11 minutes and covers basically the story of pellagra in the early 19th century in the South.
I will just
Yeah.
comment really quickly. We use this as, we do 5 or 6 different case studies in our Intro to Public Health course, and pellagra is one of them. And so now our students know the topic far better than they used to when we didn't give them this video that kind of engaged them in a way that they were like, oh, but it's still giving them factual information that we actually covered in class, but they know the 3D, the 4Ds, they know like far better than previously.
And the previous material that we gave, the one that we inherited, was like a 30-page article
Yeah.
with much more detail on all of it that they could ever possibly use.
Alicia put something in the chat. Alicia, can you tell us, actually, can I hold this for the next section? Because we're actually gonna talk about the ways that we have students engage with the different types of materials. And this seems to be a good one. Is that okay, Alicia? Like you could thumbs up us, okay.
Yep.
The next thing that we wanted to comment on was thinking about the different learning levels and course types that you might teach. And so when you're thinking about 1,000 and 2,000 level courses, we have tended to stay away from, it's not that we don't use peer-reviewed material, but we're less likely to use it with students at this level, just because they have a much harder time engaging. And so you'll see more non-traditional learning materials in this space. Whereas as they move to the 3,000, you might balance it out and have a mix of peer-reviewed and non-traditional materials. And then by the time they get to the 4,000 level, you're using more peer-reviewed traditional materials, because not only have they now been exposed over time, hopefully they've also been taught how to read a peer-reviewed article by the time they get to the 4,000 level. And then they also have their textbook. And then, so I teach across all of these levels. And this is sort of truly the way that I think about my learning materials. On my 2,000 level, I am far less likely to assign a peer-reviewed material. And by the time I get to 4,000, far more likely. The other thing that I focus on is whether I'm teaching a survey course or a course that is meant to build skills. And so when I think about that, I am going to a survey, I'm not as concerned with all of the peer-reviewed, especially if it's a lower level survey course, versus a skill building course, which is usually my higher level courses anyway. I'm going to try to have more peer-reviewed traditional material. But even in those courses, I want some engagement with what is actually going on out in the field. And that might not allow me to always use something that is peer-reviewed. So, and I might then be relying on some of the other things that we've talked about previously. Barbara, absolutely right. So as a freshman in a 1,000 level course, you absolutely don't need peer-reviewed. You also don't know what to do with it, right? Like you don't know what to do with the article. And unless you're taking the time to teach your students how to do this, because I think sometimes part of our challenge is we assume that someone along the way, right, taught them how to do it.
I would have to teach them how to read them.
Exactly. And that may be something that you choose to do, but it's not necessarily necessary.
Not at this time, no.
Yeah.
Thanks, Deborah, for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Pilar, we can go to the next slide. And so when we think about engaging with learning materials, I'm going to go back to Alicia's we're adding the debate to our engagement with learning materials, but we have so writing prompts where I ask students to actually use the learning materials to respond to a prompt. And the way that I set it up is that if they don't use the learning materials, they do not get credit for the prompt. So it forces them to engage. Video prompts, same type of thing. Even if I allow them to sort of just talk it through. I gave a video prompt this semester and I ended up with a bunch of PowerPoint presentations. I'm not really sure how that happened. I really just wanted them to talk it through and then give me their sources. But that's okay too. Short quizzes, many people give reading quizzes. I do that in some of my larger lecture courses. You might ask students to reflect on something that they've read. For me, it's a little bit different from a writing prompt because I'm asking them for opinion versus in a writing prompt, I'm asking them to give me more of an evidence base, if you can see the differentiation there. Annotations or summaries where they're just giving a small summary of what the article or the learning material was about, a worksheet where they might work through some information that they're getting from the learning materials. I've never done this before, but I know that people do put learning materials on tests, where part of the test is going to be what were you given to take in, and you have to be able to respond to that. Note taking is another way. Discussion groups, so posting it as a discussion question and students have to respond with citations or references, question sets that they have to work through. I've done this before where we might do this in class where they get a set of questions. Pilar and I did the other day. It's a large class. Students had to use all of the learning materials they had available to them. There were 28 questions, Pilar, except that not every question sheet had the same questions. So they actually then had to get up and talk to each other in order to answer all of the questions on their sheet. So they might have had 1 to 28, and then they had like every third question. And then, so not only did they have to talk to their table, it's an active learning, in an active learning classroom, talk to their table to answer questions, they then had to go mingle with other tables to talk through the learning as well. And then the last one we have on here is scavenger hunts. Where you're asking students to look for specific things throughout the reading. I like this idea that Alicia proposes of doing some sort of debate question around learning materials. Does anyone else have other ways that they have engaged with learning materials outside of the things that might be on the list?
Hi, Deborah. It's Sam.
Hi, Sam.
So I have had in a previous 3000 level class that I taught, where I had students create a video as if they were newscasters reporting on a specific topic, and they did it as a group, where they kind of did mock interviews, and some of them wound up, being really silly and fun. But I think that was a good one as kind of an end of the semester, bringing everything together activity for them.
Yeah, and with something like that, Sam, you could easily be like, here are the you have to have a certain amount of learning materials from our course, as well as outside sources involved in that learning. And so it's just another way of you incorporating the things that you have asked them to engage with over the course of the semester. Thanks, Sam, for that. Anyone else have other things that Alicia, go for it.
Sure. So one of the other things that I've had students do is curate social media posts, because that's something that, that's a language they speak really well. So last year, my students made TikTok videos around health promotion campaigns tied to the pandemic. So that was one way that they really engaged and were receptive to feedback on how to make those better. And then the other one that was on my mind, so the debates, the social media posts, and then one other one that I've been doing kind of more recently is having students take their work and do peer reviews, so that they're an anonymous peer reviews. And it's hit or miss, I think, depending on the cohort and how engaged that they are with the materials. But that's helped students to kind of identify where they're missing kind of some information, or just to see other people's viewpoints. So anonymous peer review on Canvas is something that I use in my courses.
Nice, Alicia. Thanks for sharing that. Barbara.
Well, we've been using simulations, and I only use them now and then because too much of a good thing is not so good. But we had one a couple of weeks ago where, after studying international business, and these are freshmen, these are 2 sections of freshmen, I found an interactive activity to do where they actually posed as 2 different sets of cultural people engaged in negotiations. And one set of people were specifically the host country, which was an international location, and they had to adopt or invent specific cultural norms without telling the people who were the Americans coming in to negotiate with them what those norms were. And the whole activity was about a combination of understanding that international business occurs differently in different parts of the world, and being culturally aware and sensitive to that, and operating within a global environment. And they had the best time with it. I actually had to take a couple pictures. I was so impressed. And they stayed in character, and their acting skills were amazing. We had the best time.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Barbara. I mean, I don't know how many other disciplines can do stuff like that, but if you can, if it fits with what your discipline will allow, that's a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, this was a basic business course. This is Introduction to Business. So we try to make business come alive.
Nice.
Okay.
Well, let's thank you, Barbara, for sharing. Oh, wait, we've got one more.
Hi, Celia Sinclair. Hi,
Celia.
Deborah. Hi, Pilar. And Pilar, you might not be surprised to know that I am still using ePortfolios. And I'm surprised that they're not part of the standard list, but I'm finding with 2301, Liberal Studies 2301, that I can use that on top of what first year writing is doing, with many of them are still using ePortfolio.
That's a great that's a great idea. I personally use an ePortfolio course in one of my 3,000 level courses, and I do allow them to use things from the course where they have responded to learning materials. And so it's 2 degrees removed, but it is actually still an engagement with the learning material. So yes, that is fantastic.